to the So welcome everybody to the ACNS ECR webinar about defying disciplinary divides. So as we're gathering online from across Australia, and our speakers and much of our audience are streaming from around Australia, we first want to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of country, the first innovators and scientists of the land. So we pay our respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders past and present, and recognize their continuing relationship with the land, waters, and culture. So thank you all for joining us today. I'm Denise Morel, and I'm joined by Alicia Ringen, and we'll be co-chairing the webinar today. So in the webinar, we'll hear from three researchers whose work bridges disciplines. So they'll share their experience and discuss the challenges and also the benefits of interdisciplinary collaborations. So each of the three presenters will give a 15-minute talk, and that's followed by a combined question time for all the presenters. So I will start by introducing the first speaker. So Bella, you can start sharing your screen. So the first speaker is Isabella Bauer, and she is a PhD candidate in the School of Psychology at Deakin University. So she is the student representative for the Australasian Cognitive Neuroscience Society and the Chief of Staff for Pint of Science Australia. She has a background in architecture with a Bachelor of Design in Architecture and a Master of Architecture. So she previously worked in the Office of the Victorian Government Architect in the Department of Premier and Cabinet, State of Victoria, and in the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning at the University of Melbourne. Thank you, Isabella.
Thanks, Denise. And thank you everyone for coming today. So the first thing I wanted to say is to put out some disclaimers, which is firstly that I'm a student and I'm, well, just finished PhD student, but I'm still learning my way around this. And I don't expect that I know everything around this, but I'm just going to share my experiences so far. I want to be as open and upfront as possible, and I hope it generates some really good questions throughout that I can then answer. So some of the challenges that are out there with doing interdisciplinary research is that research is showing that there's lower funding success rates. I'll put a disclaimer on that saying that it's higher if you're an established researcher, but if you're an early career researcher, there's some serious challenges there because you don't have the track record yet, and I'll go into that a little bit later. It's also been shown that you have decreased publication productivity, and that is also again coming to some of the barriers that early career researchers I think are facing, and I'll touch on them. And there's also a lack of access to support systems, so this kind of social groups and societies to support you, especially if you're in this new developing area, but also kind of structurally as well around communication and evaluation, just because of how universities are set up. However, I want to balance that by saying and being very positive about this, there's amazing opportunities from doing this. And to me, it's the people that you meet and it's the learning and perspective that you get from crossing disciplines. So the first area I was going to talk about is communication. When you've come from one discipline and you're going into another discipline, it can be extremely different. It can be different in terms of how you were taught to communicate. So for me, coming from architecture, I was taught to draw and I was taught to make models, both physical and virtual models, and build them, which is very different to science where you're writing and communicating in that way. It's also, if you think about the profession of architecture and the built environment, very applied. So it's about selling an idea, building an actual design, whereas science is very much about testing ideas, discovery. So there's these completely different backgrounds to both of these disciplines. But what's really important is that we have this clear and defined communication. So when you don't have that, when there's jargon from both sides, what can happen is there can be word meaning and appropriation of terms. And I think that's a bad thing. A classic example from where I come from is neuroarchitecture, where built environment practitioners are starting to use the term neuroarchitecture to mean neuroscience applied to architecture. but then it already has its own meaning within neuroscience. And so that can be a problem, and it's hard because you don't have a vocabulary already developed to work with. So you're trying to build across, and that takes time and understanding, but you need that coherence and legibility. So what are the kind of recommendations I have around communication? So I've broken this down and the presentation down into both individuals and stakeholders, because I don't think we can always solve all the problems that come from interdisciplinary practice just by individual early career researchers. I think it's very much about the stakeholders too. So it's important we have awareness as individuals of alternate definitions and ontologies when we're communicating across disciplines. You need the skill competency so you need to listen in to a lot of lectures, webinars, read a lot of papers, so you understand the terminology from both sides. You then need consistency in how you apply those terms, and also correction. So if you do see a word that's appearing incorrectly, this is something I really tried to do through my PhD. Instead of, I've never used the term neuroarchitecture, and please call me out if you ever see it. I don't think I will though. And I've tried to actually fit within the discipline itself. So there's environmental psychology, and that's what I classify my research as. In terms of the stakeholders though, we have to be careful that eligibility is correct as to what interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary is. So there's confusion around those meanings. Some people can call themselves these things, but it's kind of debatable. Like there's a spectrum of really how cross-disciplinary you are. We need to evaluate people to recognise that it takes time to develop these communication skills and apply that language and terminology. And that time is getting taken away from doing other things, perhaps building a track record, winning publications, getting those grants too. The next area I wanted to talk about is rigour. So when you're between disciplines, you've got multiple standards that you have to meet. And so that's, I think, trickier because it's not just one standard, it is having multiple. So for me, it was not only architecture and measuring the indoor environmental quality and making sure that was consistent throughout my experiments, but it was also meeting the needs of virtual reality and engineering, as well as neuroscience. So you're kind of doing multiple things which your disciplinary peers may not have to jump through as many hoops there. So in terms of my recommendations around rigour, opportunities to attend training is fantastic. So the very first thing I did when I came from the built environment into neuroscience was I did the Florey Institute's neuroscience coursework. So I was able to audit it, and I was the first architecture student to do that. I felt extremely out of my depth, and I think that's one of the things we learn being interdisciplinary. The imposter syndrome is very, very real, and you just have to embrace it and jump into it. Meeting that rigor of both or multiple of the disciplines that you're coming from. So again, remember that will take time away from different avenues. I still think it's a really rewarding thing to do, and it builds a really robust experimental paradigm, but it does come at a cost, and sometimes that's not always recognized. So we need to be good as individuals at communicating the time that it takes to develop those things. For stakeholders, it's really important there's openness around allowing researchers from different backgrounds to actually attend these events and these opportunities. So I've had a few barriers where I've wanted to, at the start, learn different skills, like some quite specialized statistics. I got put through extra hurdles where I was told, well, you can't just audit it, you will be evaluated on it, it will go on your transcript. So it wasn't completely open to me just to learn that new knowledge. And I was a bit like, oh, this could be dangerous. What if I get a bad grade? Because I have no experience in health statistics before, and I don't know what a proper blood pressure glucose level is, but I'm going to be evaluated on this. I jumped into it anyway, but it is really good if stakeholders can reduce those barriers. And also quality. So just making sure that when studies do get attention in the media because they're interdisciplinary and all of that, that they are good studies. And I guess we can have a debate on what that is. But again, meeting the different rigors from the different disciplines. The next, and I feel really strongly about this one, and I'm not sure how this will go for me myself, is evaluation. So I think you can be evaluated if you're in a specific discipline quite like in a linear fashion, and it's quite traditional to look at the number of publications, the number of citations, the amount of grant income that you've had. And it's really hard if you're trying to quantify and compare up to those numbers to what the experiences you had were. So for me, I know that I have all these different skills, and sometimes I'm not good at communicating that in grant applications and things like that, that I know how to communicate in different methods. I know how to work with industry. I understand from working in government how large infrastructure projects are evaluated, and space planning and all of these different things. Sometimes that's not easy to communicate, and I'd love it if we got to this area where we were actually kind of measuring all the skills and experiences rather than just that end output of how many citations have you got, because you might have bad citations too. Like, we don't know that citations are the best measure there. And same, all of these things are, I think, great things, and they've made me a really well-rounded person, but they have come at the detriment of doing an honours year where I published it and having those other things where I stack up with others. So my recommendations around evaluation is to, wherever you get the chance, to try and describe and provide evidence about this, that you have maximised your success relative to the opportunities available. Perhaps there were no societies available for environmental psychology, so you joined other societies that were quite specialised, and as a result, that's how you created those networks. With journals and publishing, I found this really difficult myself, because there were less journals for me to publish in because I was in this specialised area compared to other disciplinary fields that had heaps of journals available to them. And I think it's really important to put in some contingency planning there, that you need to think about the time that it's going to take to get past some of these obstacles. And ideally, stakeholders take this into account too, that they evaluate that there will be a career disruption for the overall track record of interdisciplinary researchers, and also set aside quotas of money to support early career transdisciplinary researchers, because otherwise the only people I think that will get to do this transdisciplinary research right at the end will be those that have come from straight disciplines where they could build up the track record, have all of those quotas required. And so we're then cutting out all these really amazing early career researchers who are building that up as they go. And then this is one of the most important ones to me, and that's why I popped it last, which is support networks. So what I'm trying to do with this diagram here, that these are meant to be two different career ladders. So one disciplines, the other disciplines. You can kind of see the steps ahead of you. You can have role models there, so you can kind of see their career journey. I feel like I'm in the middle. I'm building this like Lego construction set that's very unbalanced at the moment. I feel like it could fall on top of me at any point in time, and that's why I put the disclaimer at the start. I'm a student. I'm not sure how my career path will go, but we'll see down the track in many years to come. And I'm trying to tie it together with these supports between the disciplines to kind of brace myself and to find role models amongst both that can then pull me together. But to me, I just don't see a clear progression. It seems a bit more challenging. So my recommendations around support is to build your own community. If you don't feel like there is a specific niche for you, and I didn't think there was for me in Australia, I got involved in committees. So the Australasian Cognitive Neuroscience Society has been amazing. Being part of the Students of Brain Research Committee, that was the very first thing I did, and I had the most wonderful time. It was a lot of time and a lot of work, but I met incredible scientists as a result, and that was one of the most rewarding things I did, and they kept me going throughout the PhD. I think you can't look just for one mentor, because you're never going to find one mentor who has all the skills, so you need to look for multiple, and that goes across. I don't think that's just an interdisciplinary thing. And this is something I'm developing the further I go, an awareness that what you are doing is challenging. There isn't a clear structure in front of you. I don't like accepting that, because I would like there to be a nice, clear, linear, objective structure that I could follow, but there isn't. And just embracing that you're doing the best that you can. And for stakeholders here, I think if you're in a research group, to make interdisciplinary researchers feel welcome and valued, because it means so much to people that are on the periphery, that don't feel like they belong particularly anywhere. if they do feel like they're welcome in your group, I think that's brilliant. Invite them to your meetings, to your journal clubs, things like that, because they'll have different experiences, skills and ideas, things that you might not have thought of before. And then make sure when evaluating these researchers, again, there may not have been the supports there of having these established groups and societies that gave these awards. And so those awards are usually the start of track record building too, that you could say that you won these awards. But if you're not part of a group that has those, then how do you get started right at the beginning? So that's my slides. And yeah, I look forward to any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Bella, for that wonderful talk. It's very interesting to hear a student perspective. If anyone has any questions, please type them into our Q&A box, and our presenters will answer as many of the questions as possible once we get to the end of the webinar. Now I'm going to introduce our second speaker, Jason Chin. Jason is a lecturer at the School of Law at the University of Sydney. He's a former president of the Association for Interdisciplinary Meta-Research and Open Science, and the inaugural registered reports editor for Forensics Science International, Synergy. He has a PhD in social psychology from the University of British Columbia and a JD from the University of Toronto. Thank you, Jason, and you can take it away whenever you're ready.
Thanks. Can you see the slides okay?
Yeah, all good.
Thanks. And sorry, everyone, for the bad sound. I got locked out of my hotel room. I'm traveling. So if there's a problem, let me know. And my thing is not going to be nearly as like lucid and structured, I think, as Bella's, largely because I really don't know if I can draw any safe generalizations based on my own experience. So I thought I would just kind of go over the challenges and benefits that I've faced. But my background is that I'm a failed psychologist. I did my PhD in social psychology and was very, very bad at it. I spent the first 3 years trying to replicate and extend. The idea was to extend my PhD supervisor's like seminal work on verbal overshadowing, but I couldn't get the basic study to find anything beyond a null result. So I spent several years doing that, didn't really publish anything, and it was quite far behind on the job market and everything else, such that after I finished, I decided to go to law school and become a lawyer because I needed a job. I did that for a while. It was pretty fulfilling. But as I was practicing, I noticed a lot of problems with the scientific evidence that was being used in court, often much more serious situations than just publishing an article. How do you know that's important? So I started writing about the replicability crisis in psychology and how insights from that might help inform rules of evidence and how evidence is used in court. And that finally started getting published. So I came back to academics. So now my main areas of research are just kind of general psychology and law. So there's a whole field or subfield of this within psychology. Lots of law is just based on human psychology. So the memory of witnesses, the reason people might give confessions that are more or less accurate, and even research on how, because I think oftentimes lawyers struggle with mental health, and low levels of positive affect, how to help improve that. So I teach a class on that now, and I sometimes do some research on that. My main area of research is kind of that thing that brought me back from practicing law, which is studying the research process itself, which is very interdisciplinary. It includes doing quantitative studies of science, sociology, the sociology of science, studying journals, and kind of my contribution within all of that, which is how does all of that interact with the rules of evidence. So I've done that now for several years. I guess there's a lot of benefits. I'll go over mainly the benefits because it's been mostly helpful for me. But as Bella mentioned, there's a host of challenges. Like a lot of the fields that I work with, I don't really understand the terminology they use. They don't understand the terminology I use, and that's not just like substantive specific like areas, but even just the way we describe methods. So in some fields, it's becoming more and more common to publicly state your research methods before you do a study. Psychologists call that pre-registration. Medical researchers call that registration. Economists call that a pre-analysis plan. So it's really kind of complicated. I do struggle with like evaluation, as Bella was talking about. So I don't always know how to sell myself in a grant application, because within law, I have like way too many citations because things get cited a lot from my old psychology work. So that seems unbelievable. But if I start putting myself out as a psychologist, I have, you know, some of the worst citation numbers you could think of. So it's really hard to know how to describe that, and you end up having to do a bit of a narrative, which sounds like you're just justifying, which is challenging. And then, yeah, just trying to meet and talk to people in all these different fields can be a challenge, especially now when you don't go to conferences as much. But yeah, overall, it's been a huge benefit. Like I wouldn't have been successful as a legal researcher, and I wouldn't have been successful as a psychologist, but because I can speak to these two niche fields, these two fields in a niche way, it's very helpful. So so in the field of psychology and law, there are a lot of people who write about it who never practiced as a lawyer, or if they're a lawyer, they just have read a few psychology studies and kind of apply those. But it's really helpful just knowing how to do research in both areas, how to evaluate critically a psychology study, how to do legal research. To know both of those quite well has been a huge benefit to me. So I thought from that general stuff, I would just go through a couple of projects I've worked on, kind of reflect on how that's gone. So this has been, I think, one of the papers that I have worked on that I think is the most important. So one of the major areas of research or practice that gives evidence in court and affects people's, whether or not they're found guilty or not, is the field of forensic science. So this is a project that I worked on with Gianni Rivero and Alicia, and sorry. And the general idea is that we were sort of advocating for and providing guidelines for forensic science, which is this field like people who compare two fingerprints and say if they came from the same source or not. Trying to kind of give a general framework for how to look at that, explain why it matters in law and for justice outcomes, and also to, as I just mentioned, to explain how it would be expressed within forensic science, how these principles of open science would be expressed within forensic science. So the project, I kind of led it and had developed this kind of framework, but Gianni was extremely useful because she's a psychologist, and it's a field that is one of the major ones that have been affected by problems with irreproducible science. So she was able to explain how these processes work generally. Then Alicia came in, who's she's at the time, I think she's no longer there, was a practicing forensic scientist at the Houston Forensic Science Center. So yeah, I was able to give that framework, give the big picture, and they both filled in those respective parts. And I think it was pretty effective in doing that. We ran into a lot of these challenges, how to talk to each other, how to express these things in a way that would be understandable to all of the relevant stakeholders. But overall, I think I was pretty happy with how it came out. The other one, which I skipped ahead to accidentally earlier, is even a larger one, which that led to challenges, just the sheer number of people involved. So this was about, like legal researchers will sometimes conduct empirical research, and they often, and this engages with all the things Bella was talking about, but like legal researchers sometimes don't have any empirical training, but they'll do empirical research. Sometimes they have training as economists, political scientists, psychologists, finance, and they all publish in the same journal. It's really hard to get them to all explain their methodology in a way everyone will understand, and also to conduct research that's kind of transparent and credible. So the challenge with this was getting people from all of those fields together, and also just more general researchers to comment on this. So just picking a few people out. Crystal, she talked about qualitative research. Justin talked about criminological research, in particular, like sort of descriptive survey research. A real challenge there was to bring this all together in some coherent way, use terminology that would be understandable to all of these fields, and also just like hurting people, which is a challenge. And yeah, I guess that's what I would say about that. That was kind of the end. Happy to answer questions as part of this, or also for email, as you can see there. Yeah, thanks. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that, Jason. Just a reminder that if you have any questions, you can put them into the Q&A for Jason or for Bella, and then we can get the speakers to answer them at the end. So I will now introduce our final speaker, Cynthia Ferlini. So Cynthia is a senior lecturer in the Health and Ethics and Professionalism at Deakin University School of Medicine. She's an interdisciplinary researcher with expertise in the field of neuroethics. So her work addresses ethical issues that arise as we redefine the boundaries between treatment, maintenance, and enhancement of cognitive performance through the use of novel and repurposed technologies. So through this research, she engages with stakeholders using both qualitative and quantitative approaches. So she has led networks for students as well as early career researchers at the University of Sydney and in the Australian Association of Bioethics and Health Law. She is currently a member of the Brain Science Network EMCR Steering Committee and the Deakin School of Medicine EMCAR Committee. Thank you, Cynthia. You can start whenever you're ready.
Thanks, Denise, for the introduction, and thank you to the ACNS for the invitation to present in this webinar. Learned a lot from Bella and Jason's comments already, and the challenge of going last is that they've already said all of the really, really important things that one should take into consideration when wanting to engage in interdisciplinary research. And I have a lot of advice to add on the kind of who, what, when, where, why of doing interdisciplinary research. But in these comments, what I'm going to do is I'm going to change gear a little bit. I'm going to present kind of some high-level thoughts about, I guess, some of the things that we don't really talk about when it comes to interdisciplinary work, right? So a lot of what I like to do in the type of events that I've held and as a part of like the student and ECR networks that I am involved with, I like to do the real talk. I like to talk about the things that no one really talks about, or, you know, don't mention, or the things that I learned, you know, afterwards, so that everyone can benefit from that. So let's go. Let's go. Voila. I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm here. I join you from today. It's the Wadawurrung people of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and welcome any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues that we have on the webinar today. So I work in the field of neuroethics. Usually I would kind of ask to do a show of hands of anybody who has heard of neuroethics. On the screen here, you will see, which is one of the main definitions of neuroethics. It's by far not the only one. In general, the field asks what ought to be done in a given situation. We analyze the possibilities for an ethical course of action, try to understand the issues from different perspectives, and recommend what ought to be done. And as you can see, first, it touches upon many types of activities, right? So there's branches of neuroethics that look into research, that look into kind of clinical activities. People who look at kind of the public and cultural understanding of what we know about the brain and what we do to it. There's also a branch that looks at kind of like the theoretical and reflective underpinnings. So a lot of that has to do with how we understand concepts like free will. So there are many different types of branches. Neuroethics operates in many different realms. But I have a look at the definition specifically, and you'll see that it mentions other fields like neurology, neurosurgery, psychiatry, and all of these kind of rest on neuroscience and cognitive neuroscience. So it's actually quite a unique feature of this field that it depends on the developments of other fields. And because of that, my work in neuroethics has to be interdisciplinary. I have to, oh my goodness. Oh yeah, there we go. I have to collaborate with people outside my field. And I do that because it brings me closer. So, a lot of times interdisciplinary work is considered, something nice to do, something you might do on the side of your kind of core research. But for me, it is something that I absolutely have to do. And I do that because it brings me closer to what the experience of the ethical issues is, right? How are people, so we've been calling them stakeholders so far, which is one of the words that has many different meanings depending on what field you're in. But it looks like we do have a shared understanding of that word, so I'm going to keep using it. So it brings me closer to the experience of the stakeholders, right? Like, how can I talk about ethical courses of action if I don't understand what's really going on? Interdisciplinary work is also representative of the people and the professionals that are working in the fields of interest for a given topic, so that they can actually be part of the analysis and the recommendations and the kind of that research process. So it's participatory as well. I'm just going to open up a quick parentheses here. I think interdisciplinary research has to be participatory and it has to be integrative. Right, we talk a lot about, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary. Bella talked about transdisciplinary, and all of those have like slightly different, I think, ideas of what it is, what it means to bring people from different disciplinary disciplines together. And unfortunately, what I think happens more often than not is that interdisciplinary work is characterized as such because of the people who are around the table, not necessarily the work that actually happens, right? So oftentimes we'll have a grant that says, okay, well, we have a neuroscientist, a doctor, an ethicist, and a lawyer, and they're going to do, interdisciplinary work. But really what happens is that everyone kind of comes to the table, decides on what we're going to do, and leaves the table and goes back to their discipline and does things exactly the way they were going to do, approaches the question exactly the way that they were going to approach it, if they hadn't met with these other disciplines at all. So I think we do have to be, my vision of interdisciplinary is one that is participatory and integrative. Some of the other reasons why I engage in interdisciplinary collaborations is because it also reduces the bias in the context, in the concepts and the methods that are applied to research questions, right? If you're always in the same field with the same people reading the same papers, it means that you're always going to approach those types of questions in the same way, right? Reaching across fields can help you to kind of get out of that bubble, I suppose. And the last element is that interdisciplinary collaboration can increase the potential impact of your work, right? And in my case, it's what ought we be doing, right? If you're already working with the people who can implement what you're talking about, then that's the start of your citations, right? That is building a network, that is making sure that the people who are most concerned with your work already have access to it. And there are a lot of other fields like neuroethics that are based on developments in neuroscience. Some already established, some emerging, but all of these are interdisciplinary work is essential to all of these. So I think we're looking at a skill and an approach that will be more in demand, and especially now, people who are training, doing their graduate studies, people who are coming into being ECRs, I think as we go along, we are going to be asked to do more and more interdisciplinary research. I do take note of the job market as such is based on disciplinary hires, right? Why? Because we have schools of philosophy, we have, schools of psychology, we have faculties of, health, we have faculties of engineering. But I think the work on the ground is going to have to be more and more interdisciplinary. So I think, but just because universities hire on that model now, it doesn't mean that it is always going to be that way, right? It doesn't mean that it is the best model to produce the type of work that I think science especially is asking for now. So a couple of the kind of like second point of the things that we don't really talk about a lot in terms of interdisciplinary work is, what does it take to start working in an interdisciplinary fashion? So some of what I'm presenting here is based on some reflections with colleagues in neuroethics on the concept of neuroethics engagement. So what does it take for people to work together and to start working together and to actually get something done? And the first one is we've called it cultural curiosity, right? And that might be disciplinary, it might be geographical, for issues and experiences in other areas, right? Start by being curious, by asking questions of, well, what's it like in your field, right? If you're always sticking with people in the same field, you're going to know, and you're going to, I think it's like a muscle, right? You stop asking questions because you just know you're already in it. Something, especially in bioethics, that's happening now is a realization that, we haven't engaged, global communities as much as we should have, and that's giving rise to a lot more interdisciplinary work. So see what that looks like in your field. Another thing you might do is just have a quick look at who's citing your papers and work in your field. And I think you will be very, very surprised. I'd be really interested to hear Bella and Jason's experiences, but if you're working in cognitive neuroscience, I will bet you that your work is going beyond, right? Other people are going to be interested in what you are saying the brain can do, what kind of interventions you are testing out. And as I showed you before, that slide on all of these emerging neuro fields, you can bet that one of those has picked up what you've published. So go and have a look, because I think you will be surprised at the reach of your work. Another one that we talked about a lot, so I just came back from the International Neuroethics Society meeting in Montreal last week. And one thing that we talked about a lot was humility. Humility that recognizes the value of other sources of knowing, right? And then I think ethics gets a bad rap for that already, as being kind of, the ethics police, the people who prescribe and tell you what ought to be done and how you should be doing things. But our kind of the confines of our fields, of our respective fields, aren't the be all and end all of knowledge. I would encourage you to kind of shed any disciplinary commitments to concepts and methods that you have, and learn about how other fields would approach the same type of question. Small anecdote, early on in my career, I was kind of working alongside, not directly with, but working kind of in the same space as someone who had a background in sociology, and they churned out surveys like no tomorrow, right? Everything could be answered with a survey. My work at the time during my PhD, and a lot of it now, is qualitative. And that researcher, would listen to my presentations, but at one point said, I don't understand why you do this qualitative work. I can do everything that you just did with a survey that is more powerful and can tell you more. I mean, the point, right? But had a very, very kind of deep commitment to that methodology. You know, fast forward 10 years and now he's doing qualitative research as well because, well, you know, hindsight. But those kinds of commitments, I think, are kind of dangerous when you are trying to approach interdisciplinary work. Another thing that I think we happen to be good at in neuroethics, and I would like to see a lot of other fields kind of embrace this skill, is comfort with ambiguity and uncertainty in things like evidence, concepts, and methods, right? I do a lot of work with emerging technology. It means that there are things that we just don't know. My work has been in on the topic of cognitive enhancement. So there is a lot that we don't know about whether, you know, substances and devices work, what kind of effect they give, how safe they are, the efficacy, how many people are doing it. So, and my work tries to not just kind of answer those empirical questions, but look at what are the possibilities, what are the options for, well, if it is prevalent or if it's not prevalent, if it works or it doesn't work, if it's safe or it isn't safe. Right. And so there's a lot of potential to work on questions of what could happen. And I'm sure that there are very similar things in your fields as well. And the last, I guess, attribute is reflexivity. And I would encourage you to kind of examine the commitments, the assumptions, and the consequences of research in your field and its intersection with other fields, right? Re-examine what we thought was true and might have changed, and realize that what we know to be true now might also change. So some of my new work is looking at how we thought cognitive enhancement was going to be a really, really big problem 15 years ago. And it hasn't materialized that way, right? So those kinds of regular exercises are actually really good for interdisciplinary work. So just in the last couple of minutes, if I can get to the next slide, there we go. I want to highlight how collaborating, especially in an interdisciplinary fashion, it takes practice. Right, so if you've done it before and it didn't quite work out, don't be discouraged, because different people, different fields, different topics, it could be a whole new situation. And if you've done it and it's worked out, do not assume that they will always, your collaborations will always be that way. Why? Because as we've already heard, creating common ground on research questions, concepts, methods, definitions is a rate limiting step, right? That is the thing that will likely take you the longest. So always generally estimate the time it's going to take you and your collaborators to arrive at a shared sense of purpose. One of the best pieces of advice that I can give is to practice working in an interdisciplinary fashion with others in your cohort. So if you're a PhD student now, find other PhD students that are interested in interdisciplinary work, or find a postdoc, right? It's really great to collaborate, you know, with professors and stuff like that. But remember that the people who are at your level, they're just like you, could be the professors of tomorrow, right? So make sure that you're getting in early, right? And already developing your network of people that you're happy to collaborate with, right? Start creating that common ground that might have that might have some longevity for your career and others' careers. You can always plug into student and ECR networks in related fields, right? That might be challenging. I've written on training at the crossroads of many disciplines where you kind of feel that you belong nowhere, but that again goes back to that comfort in being not the odd one out, or just the one that does things a little bit differently. And I think we'll be seeing more interdisciplinary opportunities at the student and ECR network. And if there aren't any, as Bella said, create them. If you're interested in neuroethics. There's a Twitter account called Neuroethics Today, which has really, really good resources for getting involved or kind of starting out in discovering the field. And the last thing is, and I know that this is hard, I struggle with it myself, but make reading and networking outside of your field a habit. It's not always rewarded, and it's not always necessarily directly relevant to, you know, the paper or the chapter or the experiment that you're doing right now, but it will pay off. And it's easy as, you know, following a different Twitter account, setting up alerts for journals or journalists, reading, you know, a think piece or a long form piece on something that is related to your area, or that kind of takes the science outside into the world. And that, I think, kind of gets you going on thinking about where the opportunities and the questions will be for interdisciplinary collaboration. So there's plenty more where that came from, and I'd be really, really happy to take your questions, and thanks for listening.
Sorry, thank you for that wonderful talk, Cynthia. We'll now go to questions from the audience. So if you have any questions for any of the speakers, please pop them into the Q&A box, and I'll read them out for you. While we're waiting for any questions to come through, I might start with just a bit of a general one for any of the speakers. What would you recommend as a first step to either working with or moving across to another discipline for people that are starting to think about that move?
Do you mean like just as a collaboration, or if you're wanting to kind of reskill?
Probably more if you're wanting to reskill and sort of move into interdisciplinary sort of work.
Read. Because I think one of the things, it can be really, really difficult to do that if you have no idea of the topic that you want to work on, or kind of what even work looks like in that field, right? I get a lot of questions about, well, what do you do in neuroethics, right? What does a neuroethics paper or what does a neuroethics study look like? And I think being prepared on those kind of fundamental questions is as easy as reading.
Yeah, that's really, really helpful. Any other input from Bella or Jason?
I'll add going to events and developing that community straight away so you don't feel by yourself. So one of the very first things I did was I went to the Students of Brain Research dinner. It was a networking dinner. Terrifying. I knew one person that was going to that event. So I was walking into an event with absolutely no clue. And I got there. I still didn't know anyone. I'm very introverted too. And then put me at the table right up the front where I couldn't escape. And so as a result, I was stuck there because it was going to make more of a scene for me to leave. But as a result of being kind of forced, I made some really good contacts. I learned about neuroethics that night too, because one of the speakers was talking about like the brain and ethics and having a chip in the brain and things like that. Really fascinating. So glad I did it. And as a result, I then got involved in SOBER, developed a bigger community and network around me, and that kept me going because I felt like I was part of something.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I just have a question for Cynthia that's come through in the chat.
Wait, I think Jason was going to answer the question.
Sorry, Jason, go ahead.
Thanks, Cynthia. Sorry, it's not going to be great, but maybe one thing that I do is like talk to somebody, like just a friend in that field, and ask them how they would approach something. Because sometimes if you just like jump into some research in an area, it's hard to know if what you're reading is kind of the mainstream view or the leading view, and it was just saves a lot of time than trying to wade through something yourself.
Yeah, wonderful. So Cynthia, the question in the chat for you, do you have any advice for researchers trained in quantitative methods who want to learn about qualitative research and to start using qualitative methods?
Thanks to the person who asked the question. If you have access to a class or a short course, that would be my go-to. I see too many examples of people expecting to just kind of pick up qual methods, and you can and you can try, but the learning curve is really, really steep. And if you are picking up qual methods, chances are you are also picking up the bad habits of the person who is teaching you how to do them. And there are lots of different bad habits that you can develop in qual research. And so if you do have access to at your uni or like a MOOC or something like that, do get some kind of formal training in it. It is always worth the investment in time and potentially even money, to also have some kind of like certificate or something that will be very, very helpful for job applications. And also to demonstrate that like you care enough about something to actually study it. I think those qualifications, those types of qualifications shouldn't be sneezed at, and would be really, really appreciated by people who are hiring you and know that they don't have to kind of train you from the get-go. Because with qual projects, I find that's the hardest thing, is to get, you have a person who's really, really smart but hasn't done qual methods before, and learning on the field can be very, very time consuming. And there are some really great resources as well. There are a couple of often cited books and resources, so you can also start there if a class isn't an option.
Thank you. I've been doing a little bit of qualitative research myself lately after coming from quantitative, and it's just a whole different thing. It's such a definitely steep learning curve, so that's very helpful. Jason, were you going to say something?
Yeah, this is very anecdotal, just to reinforce the importance of projects that use multiple methods. Like something I was just at the conference I'm here doing. There's this really well-known study in my area about like judges of a particular court are much more harsh right before lunch. Some of you have probably heard of it, but there's a lot of problems with it. One, like quantitatively, just the effect size is unbelievable. Like they give no parole right before lunch, but 65% of the time they give parole earlier in the day. It's too big of an effect. And one of the main people who uncovered the problems with this study was like, she's a qualitative researcher. She said, well, I just went to the court and I asked them, and did some interviews, and they said, oh, well, we schedule different things before lunch. And that kind of just solved the thing right there. But because of our obsession with quantitative findings, that took years to figure that out.
Oh, that's super interesting.
I love that. Thank you.
Cynthia, I have one more question for you. So Cynthia, your list of attributes could apply to disciplinary research, not just interdisciplinary. We all need to be more humble and charitable, open to other ideas, views, data, thoughts, etc. But I don't see how the Global Academy keeps researchers accountable or proactively tries to foster these attributes. How can we do this? So how can we foster these important attributes?
That is a massive question and a great one at that. The way that I'm trying to do that, because you're absolutely right, it's not, it's also not like quantifiable, right? There's no interdisciplinary H index or, so it doesn't get rewarded. What my sincere hope is that by groups like ACNS, acknowledging that interdisciplinary work is important and having webinars like this where we actually get to talk about it, I think that's how we can start. First of all, talking about identifying those attributes, and then starting to get people to enact them, because I don't think that change is going to come from any type of institution. I think it's going to come from people actually doing the work, talking about what is valuable to them, and enacting them. So if you're listening, if you're out there, please have a think about how you can enact these attributes and how they apply to your work. And I think that's where we start.
Wonderful. We probably have time just for one more question. So I'll do just a bit more of a general one to open it up to the whole panel. So do you think that working across disciplines is sustainable? And have you ever throughout your career had any worries regarding career progression?
Okay, I'm going to jump in. By virtue of me having to do it in neuroethics, I think it can be sustainable. I think you learn how to make it sustainable in terms of how you talk about it, the people that you work with, and the places where you apply for funding for that kind of work. And I think it has to be sustainable because kind of the big topics that we are faced with, even just think of something like AI, right? Applications of AI cannot be addressed from an only disciplinary perspective because someone's going to mess it up. Or someone's, going to double down on a blind spot. There won't be enough kind of critical appraisal of the types of assumptions that are embedded in everybody's work, right? And there, research is about what we don't know, right? And so that has to kind of start with assumptions. And so I think interdisciplinary work can be sustainable. My advice would be to make sure that you do have some of the type of work that is recognized in your field, right? So I don't know any other way to express it, but as play the game of the bingo card that is going to be rewarded in your field, but also make sure that you're complementing that with the work that addresses kind of bigger problems and recognizing that you do need other perspectives. And like I said, people who are growing up in these emerging fields, there are heaps of neuro fields, are going to need to do that interdisciplinary work and make that sustainable. So it might just be that we are in a generation that is going to find the answer to that.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Bella, do you have a sort of student perspective on that? How have you found sort of starting a career in an interdisciplinary field?
Yeah, I really like Cynthia's answer. I think for me, the jury is still out. I'm not sure, and I'm trying to look at it as I've really enjoyed getting to meet all of these different types of people, which has broadened my perspectives as a person. And so even if it doesn't work out, because I can see the game that is academia in a way, and I can see what's rewarded, and a lot of the time I get really discouraged thinking I'm not going to meet those goals and what's required, and I'm not seeing the change happening quick enough in my eyes, so I can be quite cynical about it as to whether I'm doing the right thing or not. So I just keep on going back to, but I feel like I'm a more well-rounded person as a result, and that's been really rewarding in itself. So I don't regret anything, and if it doesn't work out, I'm still happy from the experiences.
If no one else has any input, we might wrap up there. So we have.
I just have one more thing, and that if you are curious about how people make interdisciplinary work sustainable, ask them, right? Or even if you know somebody who looks like they had a super linear trajectory, ask them about it. Ask them about their interdisciplinary work, because the more you talk about these things, the more you will discover that everyone has their zigzags, right? Everyone has their different stories. Not everybody has done that kind of, no matter what the CV looks like, right? Talk about these things, because that, I think, is one of the other things that we don't talk about enough, is people's trajectories, the challenges they've faced, where things didn't work. And one just last thing, and that's if an interdisciplinary idea isn't getting up, do not assume that it's not a good idea. People might just not be ready for it yet. And there are heaps of examples in ethics about this, and happy if you want to email me, or maybe it's another webinar, but something that an idea that isn't getting up isn't necessarily a bad idea. It's just one that might actually need more time in the ether and in everyone's consciousness to be, I guess, recognized as important and urgent.
Yeah, some really interesting points there. I'd like to thank all of the speakers today for their wonderful talks. It's given me, and I'm assuming everyone else, really a lot to think about, and some really excellent points for those that are looking at working in that sort of interdisciplinary field. I'd also like to say a big thank you to the rest of the ACNS committee for organising this, and as well to everyone for attending today. This is our last event of the year, but we will be having many more things next year, so just follow us on Twitter and look at our email, and I'm sure there'll be more events in the future. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.